So we know that we still need to do far more to prevent mass atrocities like genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, because unfortunately they do continue to be committed in countries around the world. Crimes like sexual violence, the use of child soldiers, and torture have been committed in every region around the world throughout history, and they still continue to be committed today. So unfortunately, we continue to have mass atrocities being committed around the world. There's torture, sexual violence, the use of child soldiers. These kinds of atrocities have been committed throughout history and continue to be committed today. We have had for decades international laws and covenants that prohibit them, but the problem is that we have not had enforcement mechanisms until very recently. The opportunities for trying to enforce these international laws were primarily state-to-state actions. So you had the possibility of sanctions, of having somebody expelled from an international body, for example, and yet those mechanisms are fairly weak. We did not have the opportunity that we do now for personal accountability, and including criminal accountability. So in the last 15 or 20 years, things have started to change. We have a new international criminal court that's operating in The Hague, and that is exactly its function, to hold individuals accountable for genocide, crimes against humanity, and torture. And it has served also as a catalyst for the development of national legislation to try to prevent these acts. So that's really the opportunity that we have now, is to use the ICC and to have domestic trials in countries around the world so that we have a web of accountability mechanisms and we actually have the possibility of deterrence of these crimes. Now, I will say that people often question that possibility of deterrence. Do you really have that potential just because you have laws in place and you have the International Criminal Court? Can you really deter genocide, for example? And the analogy that's important to keep in mind is that it's very similar to what we have at the domestic level. So we have domestic laws in place that prevent things like murder and other crimes. Of course, we don't prevent all crimes at the national level, but we can only imagine the chaos that we would have if we had no possibility of enforcing, and everybody knew that. And that's the kind of chaos that we have had at the international level as a result of not having these enforcement mechanisms. So there is still significant work that we need to do to enforce the international justice system. We have the ICC that's been operating in The Hague since 2003, and it exists in large part because we had very strong, coordinated, effective advocacy on the part of civil society organizations, and we had a group of like-minded countries, including Canada, that took a strong leadership role in that process. The court now exists, but there are limits on its budget, on its jurisdiction, and other challenges that it has been facing, and criticisms in its first decade or more of operations. So we continue to need to strengthen the ICC as a cornerstone of international justice. The principle of universal jurisdiction provides that you don't necessarily have to have a jurisdictional connection to the place where the cases are going to be heard. So the crimes don't necessarily have to have been committed on the territory of that country or by the nationals of that country. But it's a principle that tries to capture the spirit that we are all affected by mass atrocities in our globalized world. This is not all about African dictators, as international justice issues are often portrayed. This is also about the involvement of corporations, in particular from extractive industries, but not only, in abuses related to their overseas operations. The Canadian Centre for International Justice works on these kinds of cases where people come to us as survivors of torture, war trauma, and other serious international human rights abuses. We seek redress with their involvement. So if they would like to pursue the possibility of a criminal prosecution, civil litigation, or a complaint to an international human rights body, we work with them and we work with our international partners to try to determine what the best opportunity for redress would be. Well, I think it's important to recognize that just because we have an international criminal court operating in The Hague, that the work is not done. It's easy for people to think, there is such a court now, it can try individuals for international atrocities, and that we can simply allow it to do its work. We need to really make sure that we're always recognizing the limitations of an international institution, as important as its role is, and ensuring that we really are doing the work country by country. So that is critically important, and we still have a long way to go in Canada for this. So in terms of what people can do, we do have established organizations like CCIJ and others working on these issues. And for the average person, the most important thing they can do is to get informed, to get on our newsletters and be part of our social media feeds, to receive this kind of information, and then to respond to the requests for action, to sign petitions, to contact their members of parliament about the need for these kinds of changes that I've been talking about. Of course, financial support is always part of it. Money is fuel. We have expertise. We have networks of people doing a huge amount of work on a volunteer basis. And of course, we have some costs. And if people want to make a contribution, it allows us, particularly with this kind of legal work that has potential for very big impact, but can spread out over time, it gives us that possibility of being able to do that work and keeping that sustainable. For people who are themselves victims of atrocities, or for communities in Canada affected by atrocities, there is also on the CCIJ website the opportunity to go through the options for redress, see what might be available, and then to get in touch with us and to get involved in a much more in-depth way. And we certainly encourage people to do that.